The Veteran's Voice is brought to you by Glenbridge Health and Rehabilitation. Glenbridge is proud to sponsor the Veteran's Voice because Glenbridge would like to thank all our area veterans for all they've done for both our country and for our local communities.
I know exactly what I want to be when I grow up. I want to love and care for the people who need me, and I want to give my very, very best.
At Glenbridge Health and Rehabilitation, I'm part of a dedicated team.
Glenbridge is the area's leading skilled nursing provider. It is our goal to improve the physical, emotional, and spiritual wellness of all our residents, and that is what we do every day.
My best is at Glenbridge Health and Rehabilitation.
Also brought to you by Alfred Glover and Boone Ford Lincoln Mercury.
I never thought I'd need to go anywhere else to get a good price.
People in the high country are talking about Boone Ford Lincoln Mercury.
They treat you like a family instead of a customer.
Boone Ford goes the extra mile.
I got the price I wanted, I got the car I wanted.
Find out why everyone's talking about Boone Ford. Right now, get an oil change and tire rotation for just $19.95. Use promo code A. Boone Ford, New Market Boulevard in Boone.
Hi, welcome to another episode of the Veteran's Voice here on the Mountain Television Network, a show that's all about bringing honor and respect and showing our great appreciation for our local military heroes who have fought so valiantly for our country. I'm Terry Smith, along with my co-host here, Ken Wiley. Ken, great to see you.
Terry.
I tell you what, we got a real special show here today, don't we?
We certainly have.
Oh yeah, it's going to be fantastic. And Ed and Kathleen Schuman, great to see you, Kathleen. And thanks so much for being here with us. And really, you have kind of two stories, and well, a lot of stories in one here, because not only we have a so tell us a little bit about
we have a World War II story, and we have a post-war story, if you will, or a Vietnam story.
Yeah.
So we got three really. But basically, we're honored today to have someone who I think is a great author and has done tremendous research on her husband's father, who was in World War II. And I don't want to tell this story till it comes out in a minute, but you're going to understand why it's called Chasing the Purple Heart.
Yeah.
But we're so happy to have him here today. The father was in the Army. He was all the way from Normandy through the Belgian Bulge. He was a prisoner of war. He escaped twice. And they spent maybe 40 years of Ed's life here when he didn't have contact with his father, and finally he found him again. So
Yeah.
I'm going to bow out now and let him tell this story.
Yeah. So Ed, tell us a little bit. First of all, you know, growing up, and tell us about your mom and your dad. Start now.
Well, they're both World War II veterans. My mother was a WAC, and my father was in the Tank Corps. Yeah. And they met during a basic training in Fort Polk, Louisiana. And then they were separated again with the war. And my father was captured by the Germans and in a prisoner of war camp. And after he was liberated, they met again in England, where he was rehabilitating. And they picked up the relationship there. They were married in England, and the same church that Princess Diana was married in. And then after the war, he had trouble with PTSD and everything. And I guess when I was about 10 years old, they separated. And my mother told me that my father had a heart attack and died. So,
Ed, I believe you told me that he gave you his Purple Heart at that time.
yeah, he did. When
you were 10 years old?
When I was 10 years old, and he was leaving, he gave me the Purple Heart and told me that I was going to be the man of the family now and to keep this Purple Heart. And I kept it with me all through my life. And basically, I thought my father was dead, and then 40 years later, through my wife's genealogy, we reconnected, and
found him alive.
Yeah, it was quite an experience.
Yeah. So Kathleen, tell us. You guys got married at 1994.
1994.
And then obviously you were looking up your own family's history, and it traced you back to Italy. And then instead of going across to Italy, you decided that you'd start to look into Ed's. And then all this time, Ed didn't know that his father was still alive, and then you made the discovery. Tell us about how that happened.
Well, I was real interested in his father's side because I couldn't understand how a child knew so little about a parent.
Yeah.
And he did. He knew his dad's name. He knew he was born in South Dakota, and he knew he's in World War II. Ed didn't even know he was a POW. And as I was still so new at genealogy, I only started it in '97. And as I started doing his family, I was also involved in fighting for veterans' benefits, helping them get their benefits. And I was at the time doing his mother's. And she had given me documents, to add to genealogy, and she had given me their original wedding certificate from England. And it had Ed's grandfather's name on it. It had his father was a farmer, the town they lived in South Dakota, and it also had a number. And I was so new at genealogy that I didn't know what the number was. Well, It turned out to be his service number. And while I was on the phone with the VA, I had just asked him, I said, I'm trying to find where a veteran's buried. I might have a number that could help you. I don't know what the number is. Could you maybe tell me where this veteran's buried? And he said, it's possible but not probable. I gave him the number, and he wanted to know why I was looking for a cemetery for this veteran, and I told him why. And that's when he told me that this veteran isn't dead at all, that he's alive. And it probably was one of the few times I was, rendered speechless. And I was like, wow, how am I going to tell my husband, who thought 40 years now his father's been dead, and he's very much alive. And actually at the time we lived 2 miles from a national cemetery, and I was thinking, wow, wouldn't this be great if his dad was buried like 2 miles from our home? Yeah. And the VA has really strict privacy laws, and he couldn't tell me where his dad lived. So I hung up and went out to Ed, who was on our front porch, and I made him sit down, and I was like, I have to tell you something about your dad. And he was like, did you find out where he was buried? And I said, no, not exactly. I said, your dad isn't dead at all. And he was real confused, and so then I started telling him that you know, apparently your mother lied to you, that, you know, your dad isn't dead at all, that he's alive, but I don't know where he is.
Yeah.
We had just recently got a computer, maybe 6 months. I was still learning on the computer. And we sat in front of the computer together and we tried looking in the tri-state area for his dad and didn't find anything. And Ed said, let's try South Dakota. And I was like, okay. So we got online and started looking at the white pages in South Dakota. And there were a ton of Schumans in South Dakota, White Lake area. And I started going down the names, you know, and reading them. And he was like, I got to Richard. I said, there's 2 Richards. And he said, I know Pop had a brother Richard. I have an Uncle Dick. I know it.
Yeah.
So the first Richard I called and there was no answer. And then the second Richard I called, I made him get on the extension with me because he wanted me to call. And I'm like, you call, you know, this is about you. And he's like, I don't want to do it. I'm afraid. So we got on the phone together and I called the second Richard and I introduced myself. I said, hi, you don't know me, but I'm looking for Donald W. Schuman. He's from your area, South Dakota. And I was wondering if maybe you can tell me where he's at or if you know him. And there was dead silence. And then he said to me in a whisper, he said, my God, my brother's been looking for his sons his whole life. And Ed and I just like looked at each other and I'm like tearing up and Uncle Dick is yelling to his wife, Gert, to pick up the phone, and the 4 of us are on the phone together. It was something right out of Oprah. It was amazing, and we're all crying, and we found out his father lived in Hoboken, and his phone number was unlisted, which is why we couldn't find Schuman in the tri-state area.
Yeah.
So and that's how it all started.
That's a fantastic story. And so now that we've given the overview of that, and until we get into the detail, let's go back to the beginning and go through your father's, you know, life and his military career there and everything. You can tell us the stories as we go along. And Max, if you have that pictures of your Donald W. Schuman there, Ed's father, and he's and he's got there it is. There's some pictures there. There's your father on the left, and that's you actually there on the right. And that's a shot of you whenever you were going into Vietnam. And so you're a good-looking guy there. I think Brad Pitt would be envious right there of that back there. But you know the pictures there at the beginning, whenever he and your mother were you know, we're both in the military service, and we have a picture of that there. There they are right there together, and your father there on the left and your mother there on the right. And so tell us a little about your mother there. She was in England at the time.
Yeah, she was there when they had the, I guess they called them buzz bomb attacks and stuff, and she worked on General Eisenhower's staff as a cook. And it was just coincidence that they happened to both be there in England at the same time and reconnected.
Yeah.
Pop looked her up.
Yeah.
Pop tried finding her.
Finding her.
But your mother's name was Muriel, and she actually, you know, they'd written to each other a lot of times before he was captured, and so but then once he was captured, then obviously they couldn't communicate anymore, and then when he was brought back, he was able to relocate her and everything.
Right. There, I think it was Birmingham, England.
England.
That they were reconnected then, and then they were married right there in England.
And she was on General Eisenhower's staff there.
Yeah, as a cook.
Yeah. Yeah, that's tremendous. Yeah. So anyway, so your father. So talk about, first of all, when he first went into the army there. Tell us about how he first went in and where he went to begin with. And
let's see. He was in Fort. What's the one in Louisiana?
Fort Polk.
Fort Polk, Louisiana.
Yeah.
And then he went on to Texas, which is where I believe it was the 11th Armored Division. And he's with the 778 Tank Battalion, Company B. And they went on to Texas, and then eventually he ended up in Boston and was on the ship going over to Omaha. And I think they landed September 15th and was considered part of the D-Day invasion at Omaha. And they trekked along through France. And
walked over more than 500 miles altogether, didn't they, across France?
Yes, yes. And then actually his tank was hit the first time, and it just disabled it. No real injuries. I think shrapnel in the sergeant or something, and so they had to go to the rear and get another tank, and they started out again. And when they took over Metz, Pop said that Patton was in his tank with him.
General Patton was in his tank?
General Patton was in his tank when they captured Metz.
Yeah.
And somewhere along the way, as Pop put it, he jumped out. And then on November 30th, 1944, is when Pop's tank was blown up. And what happened was it was trickery of sorts that a Nazi would get in a, what do they call those? I don't know what they call them, along the side of the road, like they're
like a ditch.
Like a ditch.
Yeah.
And you know, he came with his hands up and everything, and a second one came out of the ditch, and I don't know what kind of weapon. What was it?
Anti-tank grenade, and the tank caught fire.
Everyone was killed.
And
in the
everyone
tank.
was killed, but Pop, when he came out of the tank, shrapnel from a machine gun blinded him in his eye, and he was captured, his left eye, and then he was captured then.
And he was walked to a hospital. They said that he collapsed a couple times, and they'd kick him and they'd drag him, and you know, all the while to this hospital. And he laid at the hospital for he had no idea how long, days, weeks, maybe. And then he was put on in a boxcar, and deplorable conditions. They were sandwiched in like sardines, according to Pop, and you know, everyone was very ill with dysentery, and there was no toilets. There was a tin can. You know, no food, no water. Days and weeks in the boxcar until they reached their destination.
And he actually, in the tank, he had 40% burns over,
yes.
I mean, second degree burns over 40% of his body.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And he also got hit in the eye, he said, and blinded in his eye.
Blinded in his
left eye.
So he wasn't even allowed to get any real treatment at all, was
No.
he?
No, in fact, he
Nothing
said
for
that
pain.
when he went to the hospital, they didn't give him anesthetic or anything. They just basically popped the eye out and took the metal from it.
Yeah. They just held him down and literally took his eyeball out of his eye socket and removed the shrapnel. And he said, and they popped it back in like a rubber band.
Yeah.
And no pain medication or anything.
Yeah.
And then he went to Stalag 12A, and then he went off to Stalag 9B. And the conditions at Stalag 9B, which is Bad Orb, are just horrible, horrible, horrible. There's no electric, there's no heat, the windows were covered with cardboard or wood, or and people were again sandwiched together in there. There was, you know, it was just horrible conditions. And then he, I believe that's where he won the death march to, I don't pronounce it correctly, it's Bad Kreuznach. Is that how you pronounce it? Bad Kreuznach. And that's where he was till he was liberated.
Well, he actually tried to escape twice, though, didn't he?
When he was at Bad Kreuznach.
Can you tell us about that?
The first time this is coming from him, he said that at nighttime they worked on the rail lines, and he was working this particular evening, and he wasn't moving fast enough for the Nazis, and they took the butt of their gun and slammed him in his back. And he said they hit him so hard it knocked him to his knees, and they thought he broke his back. And they just kicked him and dragged him up and made him go back to work. And he said he had enough of it, and he could hear Allied gunfire in the background, and so he decided to just take off. And he took off toward the sound of, you know, Allied gunfire. And
so it was nighttime then when he tried to escape?
Oh yeah, both times were night.
Yeah.
And he was captured not long after he escaped, and they took him back and threw him in what he called the hole, which was just a hole in the ground, deep enough you couldn't get out and small enough where you couldn't get comfortable. And they, every once in a while, threw him stale bread and taunted him with drops of water. He had told me that he would sometimes dream of drinking a cold beer. And then the second time, he was sick, and they took him to the hospital there in the camp he was at. And he befriended a French gal. And over the course of weeks, I believe, she ended up getting him a map, money,
And a compass.
Yeah. And they would store him away. And he ended up one night leaving, again, toward the sound of Allied gunfire. And he came across an old barn that he hid out in because he found himself in between Nazi and Allied gunfire, so he felt safe there. And he tried to wave them down. He said he took off his shirt and he was flagging them down with the shirt, but he couldn't understand why they kept shooting at him. Allied troops were shooting at him, and they wouldn't recognize him as an American soldier. And he ended up being captured again by the Nazis. The Nazis got to him before Allied forces did. And again, they handcuffed him behind his back and dragged him back to the camp, and again threw him in the hole. And I had said to him, "Pop, you would think you have learned the first time, you know." And no, so he was in there for an undetermined amount of time. He never knew how long he was really in there for.
Yeah. And then he got out, and shortly after he got out, that was when he was liberated.
He was liberated, yes. Yeah. I believe it was the 4th Armored Division liberated that area. And in this camp, there were tunnels. And he said that he was hiding out in the tunnels with some of the other prisoners. And one of the sergeants or whoever they were that were liberating the camp looked at Pop and said, "Do you know how to drive one of these trucks?" And Pop says, "I can drive anything with 4 wheels." And so they told him to drive and grab some prisoners, and they started taking off. And it was a German truck. So overhead, Allied forces were firing at the German truck. And so Pop had to pull off. And he said that they all got out and were huddled by the tires until he said, I guess someone told him that it was, he was a good guy and not the bad guys, and to stop shooting. And then someone came and picked them up, the prisoners there, and took them to Camp Lucky Strike.
Yeah. And that's tremendous.
That's a fantastic story.
Oh, yeah.
And, a lot of the guys in World War II were courageous. The courage was there. But for someone to try to escape from a German encampment, which meant normally sure death, if you had caught.
Yes.
And he did it twice. I mean, he wouldn't quit.
Yeah.
This guy
Stubborn.
was something.
Stubborn.
Yeah.
Yes.
He was brave, very brave.
Yes, very.
Oh yeah, that's tremendous. And so then he ended up coming back to England, and that's what they brought him back to England, and that's where in Birmingham then he reconnected with your mother.
Right.
And then they ended up getting married, and we do have another picture of your father and mother together. I guess about the time that they were getting married there, and so that was around the time of the wedding there, wasn't it?
Well, before they got married, when they when Pop was liberated and sent back to Birmingham, England, they did not have the information that he was a POW, and they sent him to a training camp to reestablish himself and begin training again to send him back out to fight.
Yeah.
And he was on a march, double time, and he ended up collapsing. And the staff sergeant was making fun of him and giving him a hard time, and Pop told him, "Well, you would have collapsed too if you'd been where I was." And he was questioned on it, and that's when they found out he was a POW. And Pop said, "The next thing I remember is an ambulance came and picked me up and brought me back to the hospital, and started caring for him as a POW instead of just a wounded warrior, if you will."
And it was interesting too that he actually was later guarding some prisoners. Some German prisoners.
That's when he was back here in the States.
Yeah.
You can tell him that story.
He was they had sent him out to guard these German prisoners and no one realized that he was a POW. So they were on a work detail, and during the work detail it was hot, so he took him to the PX to buy him sodas. And when they found out that he was a prisoner of war, they had sent the MPs out there with the jeeps and sirens blasting and everything because they thought he was going to do them harm. And he had told them, he says that the German soldier they weren't the ones that mistreated him so badly. It was the Nazis in the prisoner of war camp, and he held no disregard for them at all. And that was kind of funny. And
he said, they didn't do anything to me.
Yeah.
He said, I was just buying them a soda, you know. But
yeah, when they came, he was actually at the store buying
them. At the PX, buying them sodas, you know, because it was a hot day. Well,
it's funny, too, how obviously he had great heart and great, cared about people. But sometimes when you've been in a tough situation like that, you can feel more for the other person. Probably, he probably had more.
Yeah, he probably had empathy for them.
Yeah. So then they got married and then came back, and then you all were living in Detroit when you were born, weren't you?
Right. Yeah, we were living in Detroit when I was born, and then he got a job in Florida. We moved down to Miami, Florida, and basically that's where we stayed until they were divorced. And then my mother took all of us boys and went back to Michigan where her family was, and we stayed there for a while and then came back to Florida. And in between, Pop didn't know where we were.
He had taken a job in Cuba.
Yeah, he had taken a job in Cuba.
And he had come back to visit, and where they were living.
Came back to look for them, and they weren't there.
And they weren't there. Yeah. And of course, you're talking, the
pre-internet.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, wasn't even really good phone systems.
No, all you had was a phone book, and he didn't know where to look. And Muriel's family wouldn't give any information. And then as time went by, she moved everyone back to Hollywood, right? Hollywood?
No,
Miami?
It was still in Miami.
Miami. Yeah. And his sister passed away at age 6. And then there was the 4 brothers, and she would tell me these stories, and I was just so, I don't know, I just can't explain my feeling of how cold she was about. She says, I took my boys to the orphanage. And I said, for what? And she says, well, I didn't want them. And I said, well, why didn't you give them to their dad? And she says, because he's the one that left. She was just very bitter, and she just didn't want him to have anything to do with the children.
Yeah.
And, which is why she told Ed that their dad died, so he would stop bringing his dad up. And Ed questioned it because he would get letters and correspondence from Pop, and they stopped. Well, what happened was we found out Muriel was throwing the letters in the trash.
Yeah.
And that's when she told Ed that, his dad died of a heart attack.
Yeah. And so, but before he split up, and obviously when he split up, he wasn't trying to leave you all. He was just, it was a marital split up.
Yeah, he had severe PTSD, and the marriage just wasn't working out. He was spending more time away from home, and at that time nobody really understood that. They call it, I think, shell shock, and they couldn't get along. My mother wasn't that understanding, and she was very bitter that he left her with 5 kids.
Yeah.
So they basically had no contact after that. Even when my father, before he went to Cuba to work, he would come by and try to make contact with us, and she would have him thrown in jail for non-support, even though he was, and he had the receipts. So it's got to remember, this is before computers, so he actually had to be in jail and then prove that he had paid this before they would let him out.
Yeah.
And being a POW, that was very hard on him.
Being in a confined cell, he said, and he just didn't like going back to jail. And he told me one time, it just kind of brought tears to my eyes, that he said that he would park down the street and watch his kids play in the yard, because he knew if he drove up there to be with his children, Muriel would call the police, and he would go to jail.
And the other thing was with that condition too, it makes you not want confrontation, doesn't it? You know, you try to avoid.
Yeah, you try to avoid confrontation because you can't really control your emotion. You don't, you know, you go from being normal to a rage. There's no in between with it.
Yeah.
And
yeah. So but it was interesting that when you were 10, when he was leaving, he gave you that Purple Heart. And and that's in this.
Can you zoom on this?
Yeah. Yeah. So we hold that up right like that. Yeah. So here's the Purple Hearts inside there, and this is all about Donald Schuman. There was a prisoner of war.
That's all Ed had for 40 years.
For 40 years, that's all I had was that Purple Heart to remember him by.
And then and the Bible there too. Kathleen, tell us there about that.
Ed, that was one of the things Pop gave to Ed on their first visit when they first found each other in Hoboken. And Ed came home with it and said that Pop gave this to me, and he said that he carried it on him all through the war and in the camps, and how it wasn't found or taken from him is beyond, you know.
Yeah. Actually, nearly all the World War II guys had New Testaments that fit in their shirt pocket.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Just about all of us had them.
But my understanding as a POW, though, they stripped you of everything.
I would think so.
Everything. So.
Yeah. So the fact they let him keep it.
Or they didn't know he had it is, you know, he said they didn't know he had it, and I'm like, okay, you know, so it's.
Oh yeah. So that I'm sure consoled him a lot of times in that